Facebook popping in. We're just going to hang tight. I'm a little early starting our broadcast today. But I did want to see, I know some of you also participated in the discussion in the Mending the Soul Facilitator Facebook forum. And if you had any questions that you thought of while doing that, go ahead and type those into the Q&A box now, and I'll get to them during the webinar. I'll go ahead and announce this again in a minute, but feel free to comment there and ask any questions that came up for you as you were participating in that discussion. On Facebook, you can just go ahead and type it into the comments. I have that up. I'm going to try to keep my eyes on all areas tonight as we go through this. Welcome. We're just going to hang tight, everybody that just popped in, for a few minutes until 5:30, and then we'll go ahead and get started. But if you have any questions to start, any things that you were thinking of when you read the description or participated in the online discussion in the Mending the Soul Facilitator page, go ahead and type them in the Q&A box. You can also click on chat and type them there if you have any questions. Thank you for joining. We'll wait one more minute. All right. All right, so it is 5:30 and we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Steffi Butler. I work for Mending the Soul. I am the online groups facilitator trainer. That means that it's kind of confusing because we have online facilitator training and then we have online groups facilitator training. So I don't do the online training. I do the training for facilitators who want to run online groups. And I also run our webinars and do some other mentoring and things like that of facilitators. I have been with Mending the Soul as a facilitator and volunteer since 2006 on and off, and am marriage and family therapist intern here in Phoenix, Arizona. Have always had a passion for trauma and trauma healing. Today's webinar could be informative for you just as a human being interacting in the world. It could be very informative for you as a facilitator. It might also inform you if you're neither of, well, you're obviously a human, but if you're not a facilitator, it might also help inform why you're reacting the way you are when you talk to people and what's coming up for you. So today could be just self-awareness. It could also be how to interact with others. I'm hoping that you enjoy it. I will be pulling quite a bit from Brené Brown's work, in addition to the Mending the Soul book, which we'll talk about shame, which is going to actually be kind of this background issue that we address as we talk today. So I would like to go ahead and start with this. So I have here empathy and sympathy, which it's interesting. I thought when I looked for like images to include in the PowerPoint today, I looked for sympathy, and the only thing that came up was sympathy cards for when people pass away. And I thought that's really interesting, because most people, when they lose somebody, really what they want to experience is empathy, but we send them a sympathy card. And it's also interesting because I wonder if the reason we send them our sympathies is because it's too painful to empathize in that moment. So I thought that was interesting in light of what we're going to discuss today, that there really wasn't a picture of people exhibiting sympathy in the same way that there was when I looked for the images of empathy. So I have empathy inside the circle. You may have heard the definition of empathy, that it is to feel with. And that's kind of accurate, but I put it inside the circle because it really is to experience the emotions with another person. Whereas sympathy separates you from that other person. It puts distance between you and that other person. So empathy, Brené Brown says, is I see the world as you see it. I can understand and feel your feelings with you. Sympathy says, I don't understand your world, but it looks bad. So there's a definite like distancing, there's a definite separation. Empathy is connectedness, empathy is compassion, empathy is feeling with. I want to also talk about the relationship between sympathy and shame. So Brené Brown says sympathy can actually exacerbate shame, and it does that because it blocks shame resilience through blocking the empathy. So if I'm talking to you after you tell me a heavy story and I say, I don't have any clue what that feels like, but it looks horrible. What I'm doing is putting you in a position of being other than me, other than the rest of us, of feeling different and strange, which is going to bring up shame for that other person, for you, if I'm talking to you. And it's going to block the connection and create distance, which is the exact opposite of empathy. Brené Brown says that vulnerability is the antidote to shame, and shame resilience is built on empathy and connection, which we also believe at Mending the Soul. It's like one of the cornerstones of what we do. When we hear a story that is covered in shame, how do we react? So oftentimes when we hear someone express their own shame, our own shame comes up and we start to react to it. So we might actually say something to induce shame in the other person because they've triggered our own wounding, which is really common in groups. You might see this in an interaction between participants if you're a facilitator, where somebody shares a story that's really brings up a lot of shame for them, and somebody else is triggered by that because they can feel it. But instead of empathizing and feeling with the person, they react and they start to cover and shield themselves by lashing out or saying something like, I don't understand why you would have reacted that way, or you just need to pray harder, or seems to me like that person did what was normal in that situation. So it's a failure to connect. It's also a failure to relate. It's shame-inducing in that it reduces our capacity to practice empathy. So in Mending the Soul, Dr. Tracy talks about the effects of shame, the qualities of shame, what it does to us. It creates a need to compare and compete. And this is really interesting when you think about empathizing and relating to other people when they share their stories. So if we haven't dealt with our own shame, if we haven't uncovered that and dealt with it and taken it to the Lord, we are going to constantly be comparing our own story with other people's story. We're going to constantly be comparing our own pain with other people's pain. We're going to be competing, maybe even for attention. If somebody tells a story, we might say, that's nothing. I had X, Y, and Z happen before I was 10 years old. We might say, oh, I've heard worse. It's not that bad. So there's even a compare and a compete in the sense of the severity of abuse and trauma. Blame shifting, we might even call this victim blaming in this sense, where you're unable to empathize with a person because you are finding someone else to blame. It might be that you've wounded somebody and they come to you, and instead of empathizing with the pain that you've created, you turn it back on them and say, well, you did blah, 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 blah. That happens oftentimes when we haven't dealt with our own shame and pain. And sabotage intimacy. What better way to sabotage intimacy than to create distance, because we're unable to feel and respond in a compassionate way to people's emotions. So here I have a little cartoon that says, it's a doctor with a patient in the hospital. Of course I'm listening to your expression of spiritual suffering. Don't you see me making eye contact, striking an open posture, and leading towards you and nodding empathetically? So oftentimes we learn the things to do to show empathy, right? But if you don't actually feel, you're not empathizing. Empathizing requires that you feel what the other person feels. So how do we do that? Well, the first thing is to really listen, like really listen. Pay attention to the words the person is using, the words they're using to describe their experience and their emotions. And while you're doing that, pay attention to what's happening on your insides. Are you tensing up? Are you feeling sad? Are you getting anxious? As they're talking about a really terrifying situation, are you holding your breath? Pay attention, because that's your body telling you that you are having an emotional response. If you find that you're getting really heightened and that your nervous system is reacting in a way that might be overwhelming, you want to regulate. Take a deep breath. Sit back. Be careful not to close your eyes or turn away, because that could really shut someone down if they're sharing with you. But regulate yourself. Take a deep breath. Watch for physical cues from the speaker. Are they covering up their faces? Are they jittery? Are they looking scared? Are they tensing up? That could be a really good cue as to what emotion they're experiencing if they don't have words for it. So if somebody tells me a story and they do this, I say, wow, I can tell that brings up a lot of shame for you. I feel that. I can feel that right now. And that's a way to empathize, because you can see it, even though they didn't say, oh, this brings up a lot of shame for me. Allow yourself to identify your own emotions related to the story. So you might not know what their feelings are, but you can imagine what your feelings would have been. So even though your story might not be exactly the same, you can access emotions from your own story that would be applicable to their story. So you don't want to speak those onto a person by saying you felt X, Y, and Z, but you could say, I can imagine you might have felt, or I think I would have felt really scared. I think I would have felt really abandoned, would be a good way to react. So this is not you putting yourself in another person's narrative. And this is often what causes a lot of compassion fatigue, is that we imagine ourselves in the story. That can be really unhealthy, because then we will experience the trauma with the person. Then we might experience secondary trauma, and we definitely will ultimately experience fatigue by feeling and experiencing all of those stories, especially if we tend to be people that are facilitators in groups, nurses, therapists, or anybody in a helping profession. You want to be really careful that you're not imaging yourself in somebody else's narrative, but that you're accessing your own emotions in your own narrative, that you can mirror what they're feeling. I know that can sound kind of complex, so if there's questions about that, feel free to type them in at any time while we're talking. Let me see here. So what doesn't work? I asked our Mending the Soul facilitators to give me some examples of things that have been said to them in the context of group, or when they first disclosed their abuse, or things like that. And these are some of the things that they shared that were hurtful, that were shame-inducing, that did not come off as sympathy. So that's just like what happened to me. This shifts the focus away from the storyteller, and no one's story is ever the same. So how could you say this differently? You might say, wow, I experienced something really similar and it hurt. But I would caution against that, because it does shift it from you, from the other person to you. So this can be this compare and compete thing that we get caught up in when we're caught up in our own shame. Maybe we also haven't dealt with our stuff enough that we can make space for somebody else to have an experience where we're not also sharing in that. Brené Brown calls those sympathy seekers. So constantly looking for a moment to obtain sympathy, which is not healthy. So you might just say, wow, I can imagine that felt X, Y, and Z, because you're accessing your own emotions from your own experience. Any comment that tells me how I feel or should have felt, giving advice or input without asking permission. So saying, well, you should have felt really angry. A lot of girls that experience date rape have this, where people tell them that was rape. You should have felt X, Y, and Z afterwards. There's a show on Netflix right now called Unbelievable, where a girl that was raped was actually fined for a false report, because she ended up recanting, because her foster mother and everybody thought she wasn't experiencing post-rape symptoms. She wasn't feeling like she should have felt. So instead of actually hearing her, they assumed her experience was invalid because she didn't look like she should or feel like she should. Shelley says, let go or let God. I mean, I think this is pretty obvious. It dismisses, it minimizes. I know how you feel. We might be able to imagine how somebody feels. We might be able to say, I think I might have felt if that happened to me. But we want to be really careful in assuming that we know what somebody has felt. You can say, I know how it feels to be wounded. I do understand that. I know how it feels to lose a parent. But you want to be careful with assuming that you understand what somebody may not have communicated. Kath tells us, I heard one person share a challenging story from her past. When she paused, another listener said, oh, that's nothing, when I was a child, and then proceeded to top the first person's story with her own tale of difficulty. This happens a lot in group settings. And if you're a facilitator, you do want to stop it and say, let's just take a moment to really hear what person one said. Let's take a moment to really hear that and validate it. Ask questions, leaving the story so this person, Sarah, says that it's unhelpful when someone asks question, leaving the teller of the story doubter or on trial, like, well, when did that happen? And how did that happen? Your questions should be emotional in nature, like, wow, did you feel abandoned? I think I might have felt abandoned. And you want to be really careful, because sometimes when people have shared something really difficult, that's all they can share. And any more does feel like an invasion of privacy. Melissa says, calm down, relax. Both make me frustrated when all I want is to be heard. I saw a meme the other day that said, nowhere in the history of man has anybody ever calmed down because they were told to. It's so true. Those words are not helpful. When sharing one story, a listener facing the sharing one closes her eyes and flutters her eyelids, but never really opens her eyes. This is from Kath as well. Being aware of your own face, your own expressions, your own body is really important. And if you can't handle the story, it's okay to say, man, I imagine that that's really difficult, but I can actually feel my own stuff coming up. So can we be really careful with details? Or can I just pray with you? Because I know I haven't even dealt with that part of my story yet. Something like that might be really a good way to deal with it, rather than shutting the other person down. Telling someone who is actively being abused scripture about how things all work together for the good of those that love God, and then go on to say that they just need to pray more. I think I would include in this anything about God has a plan, God knew this was going to happen, God planned this for your life. It's really important that we remember God's character, and that he does not plan for our pain or for our sorrow or for our destruction. He plans that we would have, and hopes that we would have life, an abundant life, but we live in a broken world where there's sin, and that's why bad things happen, but not because God intended them for us. When a listener, usually involved in the person's life somehow, for example, a parent, turns it to be about them, completely missing the wounded person in front of them and requiring the survivor to overcome someone else's issues again. This can happen a lot in marriage and in parent-child relationships. So when we say to our husband or our wife, you know, when you said X, Y, and Z, it really hurt. And then we come back to, well, the reason I did that is because you always blah, 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 blah. Which, this is hard. Marriage is hard. Relationships with your kids are hard. It's really important that if somebody takes a step to be vulnerable enough to share a wound, that we hear and listen, and we can deal with the other stuff later. But if you bring up other stuff in the moment, you're invalidating that person's pain and also minimizing your own harm to that person. And probably the reason that you're unable to experience empathy with that person or for that person is because there's a level of guilt or shame involved, where you feel ashamed for having hurt that person. Acknowledge that. Wow, I'm really sorry, and I feel really horrible about that. I need to take a minute and deal with my stuff before we keep going. So some more things that don't work. What do you think God wants you to learn from this? From Warren. I think that's great. I think God will teach us things. I think when somebody's sharing a difficult story, it's inappropriate to jump in with, what are you learning? That can come later. Right now, God really wants us to sit with that person. That's what we can learn from it, is how to feel. Everything happens for a reason. It's not unusual for a man to behave that way. Forgive and forget, Chanel says. Let it go, pray harder, don't let bitterness take root. That's in the past, let it go. I think we've all heard these things, especially if we have past trauma from our childhood. I have trauma from a parent, and I have heard this oftentimes. There are no perfect parents. I'm sure she loved you, even though she made mistakes. That minimizes the pain. It minimizes her actions. It minimizes the fact that she was the adult and I was the child. It also minimizes the impact of abuse on a child. So defending an abuser or telling someone that the abuser probably loved them is really unhealthy. So these are some things that you all said helped you. I want to talk about them a little bit, because some of these actually are borderline sympathy, not empathy. So seeing sadness in the face of another, kind smile, any eye contact at all rather than looking away. I think these are all really great. I think if something makes you cry, cry. Don't sob. But if tears come up, let them come and let the person see them. Sometimes people have shared their painful stories so much that they don't know how to feel the emotions related to it. And seeing someone else emote correctly in response to that story is really healthy and helpful. So I think that's really good. Thank you for sharing this with me. I'm honored that you invited me into this. Excellent. If you're a facilitator and someone shares something with you that you have trouble holding because it is so big and so heavy and so bad, I've heard some pretty bad horror stories of, people getting, I can't even imagine that, which now I'm done sharing. I won't be sharing any more of my stuff with you if that's how you react. But to say, thank you for sharing that with me. I know that must have been hard is a really good response. Acknowledgement of whatever emotion is being displayed. For example, anger is an appropriate feeling for what you're facing. I think that's great. That sounds so painful. Can I pray with you now? I think that the one caution I would give here is assuming that someone wants to pray about it, assuming that that can even be a part of the relationship. So you have to be really careful. I think you have to know that that person uses prayer and that they use it in the context that you're wanting to use it, because it could feel like, I don't want to talk about this anymore, and shutting it off. So here are some really good responses that you can just memorize and keep on hand. I can imagine that is a really good way to start off. I can imagine that that was incredibly damaging to your relationship with your father. I can imagine that there have been many times you felt completely abandoned since then. I can imagine you've really longed for a mom all these years. I understand how you feel. That sounds really devastating. I understand how you feel. This is hard. Thank you for trusting me with your story. I can imagine it was not easy to share. It makes total sense that you would be angry and unforgiving. I have felt the same way. I can feel the sadness and desperation when you share. I'm so sorry you went through that. So over on the right-hand side, I've also put in blue just the phraseology you can put around the context. I understand. I can feel blank with you. You're making total sense. A lot of times when people share, they feel like it's ambiguous or it's messy and it's not in the right order. They can say, no, you're making total sense. I can imagine that it felt chaotic at the time. So I can understand you completely. That sounds horrible. That sounds awful. That sounds painful. That sounds so sad. I can feel that. When you say that sounds, you do want to also include something about yourself in it. So that sounds X, Y, and Z. I can imagine that must have been difficult, or I've felt that before too in similar situations. I would have been angry as well. I would have been sad as well. I would have felt abandoned as well. And that must have been, or I can imagine that was. So one of the things that we deal with often with our facilitators is compassion fatigue. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But I've oftentimes spoken with people who feel another person's story so strongly that it's almost as if they're now carrying the trauma. So I'm holding your story, and when you walk away, I still have it. So the way I think about this is I have at the bottom there that there's a difference between holding the story and making space for it and eating the story and taking it with us. So, I mean, think of it as somebody has their garbage, which is their trauma, and they're holding it. And let me just hold that in this space with you for a little bit. When they leave, we don't keep holding their garbage. We have to have a way to put that down and let that other person do with their garbage whatever they want to do with it, or their cake, or whatever it is that we're holding for them. I think the first step is knowing what kind of stories are especially triggering for you. So if sexual assault stories are really hard for you, be aware of that. If divorce stories are hard for you, if child abandonment stories are hard for you, if abortion stories are hard for you, you need to know that. You need to know that that's a boundary you have. And it's okay to say, I have a really low threshold for that. Details need to be very minimal for you, and that's okay to say. And it also probably shows that you still have work to do in that area, and that's okay because we all are in process. Be aware of your body during a share. So as somebody is sharing, are your shoulders going up? Are you tightening? Are you getting fidgety? Are you speeding up your speech? Are you feeling impatient, like, oh, I need to get out of here? Are you dissociating? Do you even recall their entire story, or have you completely dissociated and you're no longer present? These are really good signs that you're being triggered and you need to regulate. Your triggering can wound somebody else. So you want to regulate your body, take a deep breath, put your feet flat on the ground, put your hands on your legs, and just take a deep breath and breathe. Remember that you are present in a place listening to somebody else's story, and think about just creating space. Sometimes when people share things, we lean forward and we get very intense and we're listening like this. If it gets to be too much, it's okay to just lean back. And that movement alone can create space for the story between you and the other person. You want to try to limit imagery. A lot of us are very visual and have really active imaginations, especially if we've suffered from any CPTSD and we have flashbacks. How you can do that is continue to separate yourself from the details. Don't put yourself in their narrative. You can also ask that they just share really minimal details of the actual violent event or sexual event and the details around it. Who were the people involved? When did it happen? But not necessarily how and the finer graphic details of it. It's acceptable to ask that they not do that. You want to notice what happens for you physically, mentally, and emotionally and spiritually. So are you praying? I think it would be appropriate while someone is speaking, as long as you can listen and pray at the same time, to do that, to identify, I'm feeling very sad, because then that would be empathy. I sense that you're sad and I feel that. You might even notice that you feel a weight on your chest when someone is anxious, and you can say, wow, I can feel that anxiety, like in my own body, I can feel it. And that's the essence of empathy. That's your empathetic response coming alive. And that is a healing agent. So pay attention to that and notice what's happening for you. And ask, do you feel heavy? Because I feel really heavy when you share that. And I can imagine that in the moment it was really difficult. The difference between holding and eating the story. So I hope that makes it a little bit more clear. You're holding someone's story out here. You are not taking it in and consuming it. It's not becoming a part of your story. Any questions so far? Anybody on Facebook? Wait for 1 second. Okay. And we'll go ahead and go forward then. Sorry, I've got a couple of different screens here. Yeah, so Jennifer says it's hard not to hold it for us highly sensitive people. It's okay to hold it, Jennifer. Just don't take it in. Let it be you holding someone else's story. And it's good that you're sensitive, and it's good that you feel it. And then what we're going to talk about here next is about how to take care of yourself afterwards. Because for highly sensitive people, there is a greater emotional response. So when I say, Jennifer, when I say don't consume it, does that make sense? That you're not putting yourself in their narrative, but that you are finding in your own story a feeling that is similar to what they're experiencing. So you're not jumping into theirs. Yes, it does take practice. So if you find yourself jumping into their story or consuming their story, just say, what am I feeling right now? I'm feeling really anxious, and it reminds me of when X, Y, and Z happened to me. I'm feeling really anxious or really sad and abandoned. I can feel that in my gut, that emptiness. That's my wounding. That's not their story. So make sure that you stay in your own story and access your own emotions that mirror what they're experiencing. So I hope that makes it a little more clear. It does take practice. Catch yourself, correct yourself, and try again. Yeah. See you later, Elle. Okay. Thank you for the question, Jennifer. It is hard. Okay, so these are the 4 quadrants of self-care. I know we all hear about self-care all the time. This is before. So, I'm a therapist and life happens. I have 4 kids, and there's days that I go into session and I have not cared for myself, and I come very empty-handed to those sessions. I bring what I have. We all do. And the same is true for you if you're a facilitator. So you want to make sure that you're practicing good self-care, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. Transitions to work, transitions to trauma, grounding, self-check-in. We've talked about grounding before. The difference between grounding and mindfulness is that mindfulness is really about helping you be in touch with your mind, body, soul connection. What am I feeling in my body? How is it connected with my emotions? Am I being mindful of how my body is informing me about my emotions? Are my shoulders tense? What am I stressed out about? That's mindfulness. Grounding is, I'm feeling really not present. I'm kind of freaking out. I need to remind my body and my mind that I am here and not where all of my worries are. This person's story is taking me back to the past, to my story, and I'm freaking out, but I'm actually here and now. So you remind your body that you are in the here and now by using all 5 of your senses: sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. So take some deep breaths, put your feet flat on the ground, put your hands somewhere where you can feel texture and touch, and just say, I'm here. How do I know I'm safe? How do I know that's not happening to me? And you can do this while someone's talking to yourself. You know, like right now I'm sitting in my office. I notice that it's dark when I look at you on the screen, but it's not dark in my office. I can see chickens outside. I can feel the chair is a little rough. So that's grounding. And I know I'm safe because I'm in my home. I'm around people that love me. I've never been wounded here. So that's how I know I'm safe. And that helps me ground and connect to the here and now. Later or during the share, during group, during wherever you are, where you are experiencing an opportunity to be empathetic or show compassion. If you're a nurse, this can happen a lot for you. Focus on the task at hand, stay present and grounded, breathe, posture and body awareness. We've talked about that. Create distance or protection. So like I said, you might actually move yourself back, not obviously like you're jumping back, but just lean back in your chair if you need to, just to create some space between you and the storyteller. You may even need to take a step back. Some people, when they're telling a story, try to get really close, but if that's uncomfortable for you, it's totally okay to take a step back. Mantras, this comes from somewhere else. I would say if you have scripture that reassures you, you could put that in there. Limit the imagery. We talked about that. Notice your reactions and plan for intervention later, and leave the trauma when you leave. Jennifer, you're going to need to practice what works for you, and anybody else that is sensitive, you might actually visualize yourself like leaving their stories on the table when you leave. I'm leaving this here. I'm going to pray for them and where they take it, but I am only taking my story when I leave. So then afterwards, regular practice of relaxation techniques, physical movement, shake it out, build and use broad support. Make sure you have people that you can talk to and pray with. Take care of your physical health. This includes making sure that you are eating and moving and feeding your body, and have a life outside of work and have a life outside of mending the soul. I know some of you are doing 4 groups at a time. That's not good for you. You need to be doing other things. Transforming meaning, transitions to and from trauma and to and from work. I think that'll make sense. Right after, you might take some time on your drive home from group, if you drive to group, to relax, do some breathing exercises, visualization exercises, redirect your thinking, and then utilize support. Maybe you call your prayer partner. Any questions about that? I don't see questions on Facebook. And I don't see questions in here. Okay. Good. So this is the warning signs of compassion fatigue. So it says, and I'm sorry, it's a little bit fuzzy. Exhaustion, reduced ability to feel sympathy or empathy, anger, irritability, increased use of alcohol or drugs. This isn't addiction. This is, I used to have a really stressful job in sales, and my boss was horrific, right after I got married. And I came home and made margaritas every night, which is not my normal practice. So my husband's like, are you stressed out? And I'm like, I think I am, but I hadn't really connected at all. I just thought, I'm making margaritas, I'm a newlywed, whatever. So it doesn't need to be you're getting drunk. It can be a drink just takes the edge off. So we like to say alcohol use and not abuse. Everybody medicates somehow. Maybe you come home and have a pint of ice cream. Maybe you come home and Netflix binge. So there's a difference between medicating and self-care. dread of working with certain clients, diminished sense of enjoyment of career, disruption to worldview. Are you questioning God? Are you questioning your belief systems that you've held for a long time in a way that is really different and deep? Heightened anxiety or irrational fears, intrusive imagery or dissociation, hypersensitivity to emotional material, difficulty separating work life from personal life, absenteeism, impaired ability to make decisions, and problems with intimacy and personal relationships. My experience is that this stuff usually comes up with people that that you live with. So the people that usually are normally really easy to care for, they don't cost a lot in terms of compassion, in terms of energy, but you are doing Mending the Soul and you're working and you're doing all these other things, and you come home and you don't have time to sit with your kids, or you don't have the energy to sit with your kids without being really irritable. It's probably a good sign that you need to do some more self-care and take care of yourself. These are the 7 pillars of self-care, and the recent research I've been reading talks a lot about intention. So if I am doing all of these things to take care of myself, but my intention is not self-care, it's going to actually change the way I process these things. And all of these things can actually become really harmful and be a way of us escaping rather than caring. So I think what I want to do is talk about these things, and then I want to talk about how they could be misused. So the first is knowledge and health literacy. So making sure that you have good knowledge about what is healthy. There's a lot of people out there that'll tell you such and such diet is healthy, that you should weigh a certain amount and your body should look a certain way. I'm going to go ahead and say that that's between you and your doctor, but that being overly controlling with your food or with anything is not healthy, and that investing time in learning is really important if it's under the intention of, I want to care for myself, and so I'm going to inform myself. Mental well-being and self-awareness agency, making sure that you keep your choice, that you're not being forced into anything. Agency means that you have your own ability to say yes or no. How is your mental well-being? Are you exhausted? Are you on empty? Are you, do you know how you're doing? Are you even aware of that? Or have you totally shut down your own ability to have needs and desires? Physical activity. This is one that a lot of people use to escape because they are no longer connecting with people. They're just physically active all the time. So this could also go overboard. But there is research that shows us that our brain and our bodies release really healthy chemicals that help us recover from trauma when we exercise to the point of sweating and increase our heart rate to a certain level. Healthy eating is really important. This doesn't mean restriction. It doesn't mean just vegetables like what's on there. It means a healthy view of food. Risk avoidance. This is really important. Sometimes when we're really activated or triggered by something, we participate in risky behaviors as a way of self-medicating, self-soothing, and we want to avoid those things. Good hygiene, taking care of yourself, waking up and showering. I'm a mom of 4. I think all new moms realize at some point the power of a good shower. And that's because we have to go without them for so long. So making sure that you're giving time for yourself to caretake yourself in the way you would want to be taken care of. And then use of products and services. So making sure that you are getting therapy if you need it, that you are not over medicating, that you are actually caring for your body, mind, and soul. Any questions? That's all I have for the PowerPoint, but I do want to leave a lot of time for questions about any of the things that we covered today. So go ahead and type them in. I know it took you guys a little time last week or 2 weeks ago to get all your questions typed in. And Facebook, I also have you up, so you can ask questions there as well. You can use the Q&A box, or you can use, there we go, or you can use the chat box. Are the PowerPoints available? No, I do not make them available because I don't have permission to make all of that stuff available from the original people. But the link is available, so you can do whatever you want if you want to go back and watch the recording after it's made public. Anybody else? Facebook, any questions? Refresh Facebook. All right. All right. It doesn't look like, oh, when you share your own story, should you do the same when you did when you were a participant, or should you limit it? I think it's, I think, yes. I think that when you share your story, it should be authentic and it should be real and it should be vulnerable. You can imagine if you were an incest victim coming into a group and your facilitators were like, I've been dealing with some relationship difficulties and this group has helped me. And you leave it at that. They are not going to want to share their stuff with you. So I think being honest and authentic and modeling, sharing appropriate detail, modeling, sharing feelings and events in a way that is healthy is really good. So if you need to go back and rework those elements, do that. But I don't think that you should cut out part of your story to protect your participants if that's kind of what you're thinking. Tammy, do you find the questionnaires after groups helpful? Yes. So there's a survey at the end of the Mending the Soul curriculum, and I think it's available in the online training. And that does give you some information about how the participants felt during the group. If you can keep those anonymous in some way, it can be even better for you. But we at Mending the Soul don't manage or oversee you at all. So that is just for you or whoever at your church is overseeing you to improve and get to know better how people are reacting to you, because you might actually be doing something that you're not even aware of in group, and it's really good to get feedback. It might even be a dynamic between you and another facilitator that you're not aware is being perceived one way. Maybe you tend to be sarcastic and you're not self-aware of that. So yes, I think they can be very helpful. Jennifer, I agree. Get it out there. Share and share and share. Okay, Carrie on Facebook has kind of an important question. How can I best respond to someone who is having suicidal thoughts? Carrie, I think you have to be careful. I think suicidal thoughts are different than a plan to commit suicide, first of all. But I think you need to encourage them to get help from a professional. As facilitators, I don't think we're trained to manage that. I think if somebody says, I wish I wasn't here, I wish I was never born, that's really different than saying, I have a plan to end things. I'm not going to give a lot of advice on this because I don't think it's something that facilitators should be dealing with. I think the best thing you can do is to, give them some resources. So suicide prevention hotline is a really good one. You can Google that. Every city has one. Sorry, I can't be more helpful, Carrie. I wouldn't want to tell you to do anything and then have something happen and have you feel responsible. And I will say this, for anybody that's ever experienced suicide of a close person or someone you're working with, people don't commit suicide because of something you did or didn't do. I mean, typically, if someone really wants to commit suicide, there's very little that's going to stop them. Aside from hospitalization. So I think loving people and being present and being available is really important. One of the things I could also say is that I wouldn't entertain that conversation a whole lot. I also would not entertain a whole lot of deep feeling conversations at that point. I would try to engage their cognitive knowledge brain. What do you know to be true? What do you think? What is actually happening in the here and now? How can I help you? What do you need? Things like that. I'm a Stephen minister. We are told to ask if they have a plan to do so, and we encourage them to see a professional. Yeah, a professional would say, do you have a plan? I'm not sure I would want to ask that question, because if they do, I don't know that every facilitator feels comfortable with their plan, receiving the plan, like, okay, then what? So I think if you really feel that there is a situation, you need to encourage them to get help from a professional. Okay, sometimes I find that MTS inspires people to make decisions to confront or talk to someone involved in their story. Then they come in and utilize the group meeting to process their week. What's a kind way to redirect with the group? Sometimes the other members are curious and invested. So I'd be curious what part of MTS seems like it's encouraging people to confront their abusers, maybe. I'm not sure that, yeah, that's interesting. I would say, probably Jennifer, I would say, let's go ahead and get through our exercises and for this week. And if we have time, maybe you guys can have this conversation after group. This would be a really good way for you guys to support each other. I also run a lot of online groups, and I encourage them to have a text group with their fellow participants if they're all comfortable with it, where they can share like, hey, I had a talk with my dad this week, please be praying for me. And they can have that conversation outside of group. The participants can talk to each other outside of group. They don't need to just share in group. Tell a person who isn't aware of their abuse about it. That might be healthy for you to be able to say it can take up too much time. Yeah, you can just say like, I don't want to take up too much time with this, but can you keep it brief? And then just say, I mean, we do have rules about crosstalk in group. And so just saying, I'm feeling like there's a lot of crosstalk here. Let's finish our exercises, and anybody that has time to stay after, we can talk about it. Would probably be what I do, if you'll feel comfortable with that. Or you can just say, yeah, okay. And Carrie says, if it's in their intake form about suicide, absolutely do not let them join the group, Carrie. No. Mending the Soul brings up even more stuff. They are not ready. They need to go see a therapist. They need to get some healing before they start group. It will get worse if they're in group and they're already suicidal. Okay, that was from Facebook, and she was referring to the suicidal question. Anybody else have questions? Good facilitator questions. No, going once, going twice. All right, guys. I know we've had a time lag in getting the recordings posted. I'm working on that. We're trying to find a way to make them more easily shareable than the previous file type. So just be patient with us. But if you are registered for a group, you can share the link that way. Do I know of a group meeting in Maricopa? The best way to find a group is to go to our website and click on Find a Group. That is an accurate way of finding registered groups. We actually don't have any other list than that is available online. Okay? All right, guys, have a great evening. If anything comes up, feel free to email me at steffi.butler@mendingthesoul.org. Or you can Facebook me. Happy to answer any questions there. And I look forward to seeing you in our next webinar. Feel free to share the webinar invitations with your friends on social media. They are not just for facilitators, okay? All right, guys, thanks for coming. Bye-bye.